this afternoon? Good. Okay, well, some of you have heard this story before. I talked about my grandfather last year, and I'm going to tell the story again, but a little different way. This is an article that was posted in the Plain Dealer up in Cleveland, Ohio, which is where he lives. And this is just part of it kind of cut out. It was in the showcase last year, and we'll put it in there again this year. But this is a picture of him. They actually came to his house and they interviewed him, as they do all of the survivors of this event. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of start. I'm just not going to read the whole article, but I'm going to pick up right where they started to interview him and a little bit of the history of the story so you know a little bit about it. My grandfather's name is Jim Jarvis, and he was a survivor on a heavy cruiser called the USS Indianapolis. And how many of you have ever heard of the USS Indianapolis? Okay, maybe from me last year, or how many of you have ever seen the old movie Jaws? And when they're downstairs in that little cabin and they talk about the USS Indianapolis, and they talk about how those guys were floating in the water and there were shark-infested waters, and it was just a terrible event, and it was. But here's what my grandfather has to say about it. There was about 1,196 guys on the ship, and about 900 of them abandoned ship shortly after it was hit by two Japanese submarine torpedoes on July 30th, 1945, and it sank in 12 minutes. 4 days later, only 317 remained to be rescued. The others died from dehydration, exposure, and some sharks, because in July it's really hot and they're floating out in the ocean in the salt water. He's 92 right now. He lives in Uniontown, Ohio, which is in Stark County, and he's here to tell a story. He says, "I don't know if the sharks were as bad as some people say they were." He said he didn't really see any around him. But he said when you're down in the water, you're not really paying attention to what's going on around you, you're just trying to survive. And being nearsighted and losing his glasses made a big difference too. When he jumped in the water, he lost his glasses. And he also has, I think I told you this last year, he has a watch that he's kept until this day. And when he jumped in the water, it stopped, time stopped right when he jumped in, and he still has that today. One of the ironies of the Indianapolis disaster for the West Virginia native, which is where my grandfather was from, was that after he was drafted and went into the Navy as an aviation metalsmith, he was told that he was too nearsighted to ever serve on the ship. He always wanted to, though, and was surprised when they didn't turn down his request for duty maintaining two seaplanes aboard the Indianapolis when the cruiser made a very special cruise to the island of Tinian in the Pacific Ocean. Stowed near the ship's seaplane hangar was a wooden box labeled radio parts, but guarded by Marines 24 hours a day. And of course, my grandpa at the time had no idea what it was. They sat on it and jumped on it, and they ate their lunch on it, and played cards on it. They had no idea what it was. But the box actually held the critical parts for the atomic bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima in Japan on August 6th. How many of you have ever heard of the atomic bomb being dropped on Hiroshima? Okay. Have you ever read the book 1,000 Paper Cranes? Anybody ever read that? Okay, so you should, tell your friends about that book. It's really good, a little bit about this too. After delivering its top secret cargo, the Indianapolis headed to the Philippines to join a fleet being assembled for the planned invasion of Japan, and it was sunk en route. My grandpa said he was awakened shortly after midnight. He isn't sure why, but he instinctively grabbed a life jacket and headed for the seaplane hangar. The cruiser was tilting to the starboard, which is to the right, and water was flooding the hangar deck when he figured it was time to abandon ship and slid down the vessel's side, dropping into the ocean. Of course, no one was saying abandon ship, they were all kind of on their own, and they all decided, we gotta get off this ship. He then joined a group of about 150 other crewmen, all coated black with oil from the stricken ship. There were few rafts and little wreckage to cling to. His biggest struggle during the next 4 days was coping with the thirst that drove some of his shipmates insane. One sailor started diving beneath the waves, saying he found water on a sunken ship. I guess he'd been drinking salt water, and it just made him crazy. This is what my grandpa said. A close friend announced he was going to swim to the Philippines, which were hundreds of miles away. I don't know if the sharks got him or what. He just disappeared, and they never found him, and that was his best friend on the ship. Jarvis said he never thought he would make it. You'd have been gone if you thought that way, he said. Oh, he never thought he wouldn't make it, sorry. You'd have been gone if you thought that way, he said. You had to keep your mind on something, just looking and watching for that rescue ship or plane to go over. That's what you're looking for all the time. On the fourth day of their ordeal, now they were in the water for 5 days, the survivors were spotted by a bomber on an anti-submarine patrol, which radioed the position to the rescue ships. And that's kind of an interesting story. The guy in the plane, there were two, the pilot and the co-pilot, and something in the back of the plane was rattling. It was bothering them. And so he told his co-pilot, you need to go back there and you need to fix that. So he crawled back through the plane, and he was adjusting some wires or something, and he looks down through the bottom of the plane somehow, and he sees an oil streak. And of course, in the middle of the ocean, an oil streak means that there's probably some kind of a ship somewhere that's been sunk. So he knew that there was something around there, and they needed to circle around and keep looking. And as they looked and they kept circling, they saw all these bodies, all these guys' heads bobbing in the water. And they knew that it was something they needed to take care of very quickly. Now, after they were rescued, Jarvis learned the truth about the cruiser's secret cargo, which Jarvis was my grandpa, when the atomic bomb was dropped and Japan subsequently surrendered. Jarvis said that after the war, he didn't talk much about the sinking. Nobody paid any attention to the war stories back then because everybody had them. He quietly returned to his pre-war job of fabricating aircraft when he worked for Goodyear Aerospace in Akron on such projects as constructing the metal compartments for flotation balloons that kept space capsules afloat in the ocean after returning to the Earth. Have you ever seen a spacecraft come down from after they've been in space, and it kind of looks like that triangular shaped dome looking thing, and it falls into the water, the guys are sinking in there? Have you ever seen that on TV or in pictures, maybe? Well, there's flotation devices, because it falls from the sky, it falls into the water, and it has to float or it would sink, and my grandpa built those flotation devices on that so those guys wouldn't sink. He also worked on Goodyear's experimental rubber inflatable airplanes. Doesn't that sound like a good idea? You want to fly in a rubber airplane? Sounds safe. And on the U.S. anti-missile systems in Europe. He got married in 1947, and he and his wife, Lucille, raised a daughter, which is my mom, and he has 2 grandchildren, me, my sister. Jarvis kept the wristwatch and the dog tags he wore during that 4-day ordeal at sea. The mementos are still encrusted with dried black bunker oil from the ship. Not a day goes by, he says, that something doesn't remind you of it several times a day. However, he's probably one of the few people who could even find some humor in the horror 69 years later. Every now and then, he'll wear a shirt that his granddaughter gave him, which my sister made, and it says on the front of it, USS Indianapolis Swim Team. She made those for all of the guys. So every year, there's a reunion in Indianapolis that's in July, and all of the guys, there's one night where everybody dresses up and we have a big dinner, and then the next night, everybody wears their USS Indianapolis Swim Team shirt. And the guys think it's kind of funny. So use today to thank a veteran, and they're probably wearing a hat or a t-shirt or something. If you go out to dinner tonight, a lot of veterans eat free tonight in places, so if you go and you see a veteran, hug them around the neck, shake their hands, tell them thank you. If you don't see any, go visit a local cemetery. There's one right across the street, and they look for a headstone that has the United States flag, and that was probably someone who served in the military. You can quietly say thank you to them for what they've done and for the freedom that they have given to you. Thank you.